Yeah, I will.
So I press share screen. I
Yes.
do that. And then I move that there. Can we
Look at
see
that.
that? Can you
Yeah,
see that?
we can see it.
Okay. And we're ready to roll. All right. Thank you all for coming. And aren't we all glad that we can do this Zoom program? Because if this was an in-person program, we probably would have canceled it due to the weather. So here's a time when I'm glad to be on Zoom with you all. I know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue out there, and I hope I don't put you over the edge with more Zoom fatigue tonight. Like Corey said, I work at the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History in Springdale, and while I'm working from home, the museum is open. To let y'all know, the museum right now is open Monday through Friday from 10 to 5. Admission is free. COVID protocols are in place, so mask up and come see us at the museum in downtown Springdale. I won't be there to hug your neck, but once I get vaccinated and it's safe to hug necks again, I'll look forward to hugging your neck when you come in the door. This is one of my favorite Ozark figures, Ozark personages to talk about, to share the story of Ted Richmond. And I'm going to refer to my notes, so I apologize in advance for that, but there's so much I want to tell you. I've got to stay on task. All right. The story starts here in a sod house in Nebraska. We think this is the house that Ted Richmond, James Theodore Richmond, was born in 1890. His family moved to Iowa when Ted was 2 years old, and he graduated from high school in Iowa. Now, sometime between 1910 and 1917, the Richmond family, Ted went with his parents, he was a young adult by then, went to the Ozarks, moved to Evening Shade, Missouri, which is, maybe an hour east of Springfield, Missouri. So in the Missouri Ozarks, smack in the middle of the Mark Twain National Forest. Now, the question arises, why did the Richmond family move from Iowa to the Ozarks of Missouri? And I don't know, but here's a guess. Here's a guess. In 1907, Harold Bell Wright published this book set in the Ozarks, The Shepherd of the Hills, and it was a wildly popular book, which actually caused many people to uproot and move to the Ozarks. It drew so much attention to this idyllic idea of the Ozarks as a place, again, where kind of time stood still. That's kind of what people writing about the Ozarks, especially in the early 1900s, like to portray our region as a place where has stood still, where that time forgot. So that was a draw to many people. So maybe the Richmond family moved as a result of this book by Harold Bell Wright. I don't know. I don't know that. What I find about Ted next is once he's in Evening Shade, this is his World War I draft registration card. And you can see that red line. He lists his occupation as journalist and farmer, and he lists his age as 27. I almost feel guilty in sharing his age because Ted was notorious in his life never to divulge his age. So I hope he's not looking down on me, frowning too much at me telling you that he was 27 years old when in 1917, as he described it, by special invitation of a doting Uncle Sam, I accepted a position as a buck private in World War I in the field artillery and did my best to please Uncle. Now, that was before Ted went to war, he, along with being a journalist and farmer, as he's noted here, he was also a school librarian in Evening Shade and a Sunday school teacher. And throughout his life, Ted Richmond was a man of very deep faith, very deep faith. It will come up over and over again how much his faith influenced his life. But here's the thing: he came back from World War I probably with what we call today PTSD. People that I'd had the good fortune to interview, a couple of people that still live in Newton County that were very young when Ted lived there, and that were old enough to remember Ted, and their families were good friends with Ted. And both of the people I talked to, in looking back at Ted from our filter today, said they felt like he was suffering from something akin to PTSD, that he as a result of his service in World War I. So we know that after he came back from World War I, he attended the University of Chicago for a couple of years. And then he ended up in Springfield, Missouri at the Southwest Missouri State Teachers College. And there he was editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. Let me click. There's a picture of a very good-looking Ted Richmond. He was a man of small stature, but had these kind of deep penetrating eyes. I can see why he would be a kind of a charismatic figure to people that he met. He was the editor of the school newspaper there, and it was in 1924 that we first see his nickname, Twilight Ted. He came up with that nickname himself while he was still even in evening shade, but it's when he was at the college in Springfield that he really starts using that as he begins writing for local newspapers as kind of a stringer. He was writing for several newspapers at a time there in the Springfield area, Missouri Ozarks. Then here by 1925, look at him, he's sporting a mustache now, and he's still at Missouri State Teachers College. And this is the first time that we see there in the text of the yearbook, this phrase, fighting for things eternal. That was Ted's lifelong slogan. We are fighting for things eternal. When he attended college, in Springfield, he also started his own publishing company, the Ozark News and Feature Service. Journalism was truly his love. He started a club in Springfield for aspiring newspaper and magazine cartoonists, and made the newspaper in Springfield when he agreed to allow young women to come to these meetings of the cartoonists and the journalists. He was kind of I think he was probably a trailblazer as far as women's rights, and thinking that it was perfectly acceptable for a woman who wanted to be a cartoonist or a journalist in that day and time. He started a magazine. He called it Twilight Ted's Trumpet. It was, as he's heralding there, a new national monthly publication for everybody. And there you see a slogan at the bottom of this ad, we're fighting for things eternal. So it looks like he's setting himself up for a journalism career in Springfield, Missouri. But by 1927, we find him in Arkansas, in Kingston, Arkansas, over in Madison County, where he was a member of the faculty at the Kingston Community High School. And you see him there in the lower right corner. He was director of boys' work at the Kingston Community High School. Now, this is when Kingston was really known as an educational mecca for rural kids in Madison County, especially because a wealthy church in Rochester, New York, the Brick Presbyterian Church, had sent a minister there and started an outreach program in Kingston to, and I'm quoting in their publicity, what they said is they were going to educate the poor whites. This was going on in the Appalachians. This was a popular church outreach for wealthy congregations, mostly in the eastern United States, to set up schools and churches in remote rural areas in the mountains, and this trickled down into the Ozarks. And so this was established in Kingston. By the time Ted got there, the Kingston school that was being funded by the Presbyterians in Rochester, New York, was a fine school, beautiful school. They had a doctor's office, they had a small hospital, a community building. So Ted Richmond was in a good place as director of boys' work at the Kingston Community High School. Now, he arrived there by hitchhiking 180 miles from Evening Shade, Missouri. He had gone home after college and in Springfield back to Evening Shade. So he made it down to Kingston by hitchhiking, and he was there at the request of the one of the school superintendent, who was Otto Ernest Rayburn. Otto Ernest Rayburn became well known in local history as a folklorist and writer in his own right. So Rayburn and Richmond, their lives mirrored each other in several ways. They were both born in 1890. They were both Midwesterners. Rayburn was born in Kansas and Richmond in Nebraska. Both of them loved the printed word and had high aspirations to have their own magazine publications. Both were freelance writers and teachers, educators, and they decided to make a go of it together in the world of magazine publishing. Rayburn had a magazine called Ozark Life, and Ted with his Twilight Ted's Trumpet. So Rayburn and Richmond formed this company called King's Craft Publications. The Hillbilly is the Kingston High School yearbook. So it was obviously printed by Otto Rayburn and Ted Richmond. So this printing company, publishing company, King's Craft, was headquartered in Kingston, Arkansas. And look at that. It's soon after Ted arrives is carrying his slogan, "We are fighting for things eternal." So evidently Otto Rayburn thought that was a fine slogan to tack on to his publishing venture. Ted decided to establish a Kingston branch of his Ozark News and Feature Service. And really, if you've been to Kingston, Arkansas, which is a beautiful, lovely community, and just think in the early 1900s, 1920s, that the vision for Ted Richmond and Otto Rayburn is this is going to be a kind of a publishing mecca for the region in Kingston, Arkansas. So Ted was going to establish his Ozark News Service there. He said he would change the name, though. He was going to call it Ozarkadia. And there he said he would continue his work to, quote, support freedom of the press, constructive journalism, and absolute editorial independence in all things. So that was Ted's part of the publication business. And his partner, Otto Rayburn, was going to publish this magazine, Ozark Life, which he did in several iterations for a few years. Ted was business manager for Ozark Life, and Otto Rayburn was the editor. It was the official publication of a group called the Ozarkians, which was a society of regional writers and artists founded in Kingston in 1927. And if you're interested in Ozark literary history at all, these Ozarkians, this society, there are some pretty big names as far as regional writers in this society. It's quite interesting to think of people like Rosa Marinoni, Vance Randolph, and others founding this society that was in Kingston and being charter members of it. Well, I don't know what happened, but in 1930, Ted Richmond and Otto Rayburn moved their publishing business from Kingston to Winslow, Arkansas. And evidently they were receiving letters from all over the world. Here are a couple of letters that are in our Shiloh Museum collection addressed to Ted Richmond. You see the one on the top is from Mexico, and this one on the bottom is from England. They are writing. They had somehow gotten hold of copies of Ozark Life magazine and were writing. So it was obviously a popular publication, was seemingly doing fairly well, but they really weren't, not for very long. By the time these letters are postmarked 1930s, the magazine had started struggling, and here was an idea. Ted Richmond was never short on ideas, and he and Otto Rayburn came up with an idea to boost some life into the magazine. They were going to start publishing Ozark Life on a 13-month calendar. Now, a 13-month calendar was not the invention of Otto Rayburn and Ted Richmond, but it was a fairly new idea in the 1930s. And the way the calendar worked, every month had the same number of days. The days and dates always fell on the same identical pattern every year. And the 13th month would be called Sol, S-O-L, like Sol the sun. And they thought that would be unique enough to boost the attention of their magazine and drum up business. But sadly, the venture was a failure. And in the early 1930s, they sold their magazine business and parted ways, but remained friends for the rest of their lives. Otto Rayburn came to visit Ted at his wilderness library on several occasions. So here's Ted Richmond in the early 1930s in Winslow, Arkansas. And I don't know, I'm still trying to figure this out, what led him to this setting in Newton County, Arkansas. It's the Depression years. His magazine is a bust. He's suffering from what we think is probably PTSD. What's he going to do next? Well, he makes his way to Newton County, Arkansas, where he homesteads 160 acres at Mount Sherman. Now, if you're familiar with Newton County and you know where Camp Orr, the Boy Scout camp is, or the road to Kyle's Landing, that on that road to Kyle's Landing, there's a turnoff that would have taken you, that was Ted's Twilight Trail, as he called it, and would have taken you down to his cabin. So that's the area that I'm talking about that he homesteaded. He once said in an interview, quote, that my persistent $64 question is, "Oh, civilization, so-called, where do we go from here?" And I think that is maybe as accurate a reason as any for why he might have chose to remove himself to a remote, sparsely settled, beautiful section of the Arkansas Ozarks. And once he got there, it didn't take him long to decide that his neighbors needed access to reading materials. He said that they're far away, no fault of their own, but they live in remote areas and they can't get to an existing library, and the roads are bad and the mountains are hard to traverse. And for various reasons, he thought that it would be a good idea to help his neighbors have access to reading material. And he said he loved to explore the caves on his property. There were several small caves. And he said, as he recalled, that one day he was exploring a cave and he went inside the cave and had a talk with God. He said, "I opened my Bible and prayed through the night that God would help me bring good books to bright mountaineers." He's carrying his Bible with him as he was exploring the caves. And so it was that in 1932, the Wilderness Library was born in Ted Richmond's one-room log cabin at a place he called his Wilderness Cabin on Twilight Trail. The first book in the library was a New Testament that his mother donated and sent to him, followed by half a dozen books that the local editor of the Newton County Informer newspaper donated to the cause. His good neighbor, Hugh Rainey, built the first bookshelf for the Wilderness Library. And Ted started raising this small herd of dairy goats as a way to provide some income for himself and the library. For his whole existence, Ted was living literally hand to mouth, and money was always a question. And he really did most of his fundraising for the library, not for his own well-being, but it was always a concern. How was he gonna make ends meet? Books at the library could be checked out free of charge. There were no late fees. There was no card catalog or no index. From what folks I've talked to that remember the library said, there was just a notebook at the door, right inside the door. You just signed your name to what book you were taking, and you could bring it back whenever you wanted to. Now, Ted, being a journalist at heart and by trade, he knew that the key to success was to get the word out. And so he starts sending letters to newspapers all over the country, asking for donations, such as this one he has written to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And he was also a really great promoter and maybe a little bit of a showman, but throughout the 2 decades of his keeping of the Wilderness Library, there were constant newspaper articles. Let me just run through just a smattering of them. And you know, when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Kansas City Star pick up your stories, then those go out on wire services and are distributed all across the country. So this was a key to success. His knowledge of how to be a publicist and how to keep his story in the news was really benefited. And I don't know what he would have done had he not had that skill. Books started arriving from across the country. People just sent him boxes of books. They were delivered here to the Mount Sherman post office, which was in the home of Burl and Julie Kilgore. And that's Ted on the front porch with Mrs. Kilgore. They would open crates of books. Here is a picture of, there's Ted right there, opening books and handing them out. And there was a fellow that I interviewed named Earl Rainey, who was a young boy, a young teenage boy, when Ted was there with his library, said he remembered Ted going around saying, books, books, books. We can't eat books. You know, he was getting lots of donations of books, but he had no way to make a living. He was not doing anything financially other than to raise these goats and maybe sell the milk from the goats. His neighbors would often feed him supper, often. Earl Rainey said he remembered that Ted was just happened to arrive for a visit about supper time. And of course, Earl's mama always invited him in for supper. He would not sell the timber on his land. He had a beautiful, of course, wooded land on that 160 acres, but he was afraid that the wood, most of it being oak, if he sold it, it would be processed and made into whiskey barrels. And he was very much against liquor of any kind. In fact, he himself said he never drank anything stronger than coffee, and very rarely did he ever drink coffee. So he didn't use the timber on his land as a source of income. One of his projects that he dreamed up was a wilderness white Christmas, where he asked for donations of books, clothing, toys, games, musical instruments, medical supplies, fruit and candy. He asked for people all over the country to send things that people need, that people could use, that families could use, that he would then distribute to the families in Newton County. And that was quite a success for a few years. He helped a lot of folks there with his Wilderness White Christmas. Here's a photo from the Christian Science Monitor of Ted and some folks receiving some books in 1947. Ted was quoted as saying, "My people were far away from city libraries, so I brought the books to them." You see, he's got a stack of newspapers, magazines. His cabin was literally overflowing with reading material, to the point that the Wilderness Library left no room for Ted to even lay his head inside the cabin. He had to move out. He had to find another place to live. And the story that newspapers, maybe, I don't know if Ted himself told them this. I don't know where they got the story, I guess from Ted. But the story was that Ted moved to a nearby cabin, and on the way there, a wildcat followed him down the trail. So he named the place Wildcat Cabin. But I want to go on record as hearing it from the mouth of Earl Rainey, who is in his 90s now, who said that is not true. Earl said, "My daddy traded a cabin for some goats, for some of Ted's goats. So Ted gave my daddy some goats. We gave him a little cabin to live in. And once Ted moved in there, he found that there was a wildcat living under the cabin." So that, I'm going on record, that is how Ted's Wildcat Cabin came to be named. This is maybe the best interior photo of one of his libraries. His libraries grew. He started having branch libraries in people's homes. Someone would build a little cabin on their property and make that a branch library. At one time, Ted Richmond estimated that he had some 20,000 books available at the library and at its branch locations. And there was, the named branches that I know of are the Jeff Rainey branch, the James Kilgore branch, the Mount Sherman Church branch, and also people would just keep a small bookshelf in their homes and invite people to to check out books there. It's kind of like the little free library movement that we have today. Very similar. This fellow right here, Jethro Rainey, I had the pleasure of interviewing him as I was starting my research on Ted Richmond. And Jethro grew up to become principal and superintendent, I believe, of Mount Judy schools. And I've often wondered, well, I've often thought of the influence that the ability to have books made on Jethro Rainey as his career ended up being one in education. Let's see. So Ted would deliver books as well as invite people to come by the Wilderness Library. And he would deliver them in this backpack. It's kind of homemade backpack. Now, I doubt that he wore a necktie when he was tromping around the hills in Newton County. That's probably he dressed up for the photograph. But this backpack had to weigh many pounds. And I'm thrilled to say that backpack still exists today. If you ever, he also, there he is there's a good picture of his pack. You see how big that thing is as he's getting in a John boat to cross the Buffalo River. You know, there was nothing stopped him in delivering his books, kind of like the mailman. But the backpack still exists. There it is. If you ever go over to Jasper, go in the Newton County Library, which is a delightful library, a wonderful small community library. And they have his backpack on exhibit there on display. And it is really a treat to see that. As I keep saying, Ted was a promoter. These are his business cards. This is what his business card looked like. And again, you see his slogan, "We're fighting for things eternal." He had letterhead printed. He wrote and received so many letters. And I've talked to a fellow who remembered the Wilderness Library after it was no more, after Ted was no longer doing the Wilderness Library, that the books and the correspondence, everything was just sitting in this little log building. And most of it just was lost to time and the elements. But it was amazing, the prolificness of Ted's writing, constantly looking for support for his library. He incorporated the Wilderness Library in 1950 in hopes that would help boost his fundraising, but it didn't really help at all. He had, as you see on the left of the letterhead, Sid Mcmath, governor of Arkansas, was the honorary chairman of the Wilderness Library Advisory Council. He had some notable folks who supported him in name anyway, but he just couldn't really get the kind of attention he needed until, he said, he started writing in the 1940s to Eleanor Roosevelt when she was First Lady of the United States. When I first read that, I thought, okay, yeah, that's folklore. Ted Richmond in Newton County writing to Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, lo and behold, in the Roosevelt archives at the FDR Library, in Eleanor's archives, are letters from Ted Richmond to Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, let me explain a minute. There's the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, on the left. The woman in the center is her personal secretary, Malvina Thompson, who went by the nickname of Tommy. So I'm going to refer to her as Tommy Thompson. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt she was, a people's first lady. She had a column in the newspaper. She was very engaged with the public and received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters every day, tens of thousands of letters a year. So Tommy Thompson, as Eleanor's personal secretary, would sit down each morning, go through the day's mail, pull out personal letters, sort it into what's from a government department, what's from this senator or congressman, what letters, in Tommy's vision, are ones that Eleanor herself should see. So Tommy would select a certain amount of letters every day, send them on to the First Lady, and the mass of the letters would go on to the White House Social Bureau, where over 20 people were employed, classifying the letters, answering them, sending them on to the appropriate department in the government. If somebody's email or writing saying, do you have any information on how to can tomatoes, that would go on to the appropriate agency. So Tommy Thompson would get this mail to Eleanor Roosevelt, and Tommy Thompson would answer the letters herself when it was possible, or she would dictate an answer for Mrs. Roosevelt to sign. So there were about 50 letters a day that Tommy would pick out and send on to Mrs. Roosevelt. If there were something that struck Tommy's interest, as this is something I really need to point out to Mrs. Roosevelt, she would make sure that Mrs. Roosevelt saw these letters. And it is clear that Eleanor Roosevelt saw Ted Richmond's letters, because here's an example. So it's written February 20, or it's received February 21st, 1944. Ted has typewritten this letter, and this is a great letter. This letter is him he's thanking for books that Mrs. Roosevelt has sent to the library. She also sent batteries. He was always looking for batteries for his radio because he wanted the radio to work so that people could come in and hear the news on his radio. He was constantly asking her to please come to Newton County. And the bulk of this letter is him telling her how to get to Mount Sherman, to the Wilderness Library. You need to take a plane or a train to St. Louis or Kansas City. Then you can come by bus down to Springfield or maybe even to Harrison. From Harrison, you can get on the mail truck and come to Newton County. And then if I know you're coming, he says, if we know you're coming ahead of time, I'll arrange for someone to pick you up and bring you down here to the Wilderness Library. It's delightful. So this correspondence in the Eleanor Roosevelt archives dates from 1944, when she's still First Lady, and also after she leaves the White House. So in 1947, 1949, and 1952, there are letters to and from Ted Richmond, between Ted Richmond and Eleanor Roosevelt in Eleanor Roosevelt's archives. He more than once, he asks her again to come for a visit, and she never does, but she never just outright says, of course, I'm not coming to Newton County, Arkansas. She always says, if my schedule will allow it, if, I'm getting ready to go to Hyde Park. She was very kind and genuinely interested to him. Now, let me show you. This is Eleanor's handwriting. It's extraordinary handwriting. Let me give you a close-up. It's extraordinarily difficult to read. I don't know if I've ever seen any handwriting so difficult to read. You can see this is Tommy Thompson's, her secretary's note that this letter was acknowledged on February 24th. So pretty quick, just 3 days. But so Mrs. Roosevelt would take this letter and write this note on it and give it back to Tommy. And then Tommy would type out the final note back to Ted Richmond. So here's what that would look like. This is what this says. Tommy Thompson could read that handwriting and type it out. And then she would type out the letter, send it back to Mrs. Roosevelt for her signature. So this is just, every time I think about this, I just get so excited to think, here's this eccentric man in the middle of Newton County in the 40s, remote as it can be, that has gotten the attention and the admiration of Eleanor Roosevelt, of a world leader. Now, Ted has got Eleanor Roosevelt's attention, so I don't know if that's what made him decide to get into politics, but he gets into politics. In September of 1946, he and several other Newton County veterans of World War I and World War II organized a county political party with the announced purpose of, quote, cleaning up local politics, promoting honest elections, and electing veterans to county offices. Now look who's at the top of the GI ticket, Ted Richmond. Every one of these candidates was soundly defeated by the Republican challengers, all of whom were members, longtime members of the Newton County political elite. And Ted evidently was a thorn in the side of these Newton County politicians. He was not shy about it. He called it the Newton County political machine. And it certainly appears to me that there was such a thing in Ted's day. In 1949, at the request of Eleanor Roosevelt, Senator J. William Fulbright looked into Ted's struggles to pay off his Farmers Home Administration mortgage. Ted was trying to pay the mortgage on his property and was having trouble because Ted claimed that the Newton County Federal Farmers Home Administration administrator was in cahoots with the Newton County political machine. And Ted had made those men angry with Ted's constantly calling them out on their shady dealings. So in March of 49, Senator Fulbright wrote Mrs. Roosevelt to let her know that he had received word from the Arkansas director of the Farmers Home Administration that Ted Richmond had paid off the mortgage. And he said to Mrs. Roosevelt, I am happy to tell you that the Ted Richmond case is closed. His mortgage has been paid. And come to find out, in a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt, Ted Richmond confirmed that, yes, his brother had come, and his brother was a doctor in the Midwest and had paid off the mortgage, but not before all this trouble with the Newton County political machine. And Eleanor sent a note to Ted Richmond. She said, I am very glad to know that your difficulties are behind you. So she takes a minute to write to Ted Richmond in 49 saying, I'm glad this is behind you. Well, not so quick, Mrs. Roosevelt. Ted wrote back to her. This is the envelope of a letter that he sent back after his mortgage had been paid. So this is the front of the letter. And it got there because it's now in the Eleanor Roosevelt archives. On the back of the envelope was this, and I've got it transcribed here, but this is Ted's note. Note to Mrs. FDR, the Jasper boss ring often opens people's mail to get information as to who is for and who is against the ring. If it appears that this letter has been opened, please let the post office department take fingerprints. Thanks, Ted R. So you see, he's taped it shut. He's telling Mrs. Roosevelt, if this tape is cut, if this letter has been opened before you get it, take fingerprints. And it's the Newton County machine that's behind it. The inside this envelope was a 3-page letter that's just extraordinary. And Ted talks about 3 murders that happened on the Newton County Square within a week of each other. All men, 3 men that had various reasons gone up against the Newton County political machine and ended up being gunned down, murdered. And it's true. This is in the Arkansas Gazette. This is carried in the newspapers. And they were never, the people who did this were never caught. There was never no trial for these 3 murders. So Ted Richmond is telling Mrs. Roosevelt about this and saying, you've got to get the FBI down here. Can't you talk to J. Edgar Hoover? Ted Richmond is asking Eleanor Roosevelt, please send the FBI, send some other undercover operatives down here to Newton County. We've got to break this ring up. Please speak to J. Edgar Hoover yourself. And he says, you know, I could come to Hyde Park if I can get money to come to Hyde Park and talk to you about this. Would you meet with me? He was sincerely concerned about this political corruption that was happening in Newton County. But yet You think there's Ted on the left. If he is stirring up this kind of trouble with the powerful elite of Newton County, does he have any friends? Yes, Ted was loved by many, many people. Photos of just from family photo collections bear this out. Here he is with a group of folks and the preacher of the Assembly of God Church. There's Ted right there at a baptism. This is a great story. I don't think Ted is in this picture because he is down in this sinkhole. Here is a great story that goes with a couple of pictures I'm going to show you. In the winter of 1946, Burl and Warren Kilgore went coon hunting, taking their famous coonhound, locally famous coonhound named Jack. And the story is that they trailed through Wild Bear Creek, and the hound hit a scent that took him off, lickety split, and the dog disappeared. Burl and Warren called the dog. The dog never came. They couldn't hear him baying. They could not find poor old Jack. For a few days and nights, they searched for Jack. And then all of a sudden they were out, and Burl Kilgore heard Jack. He was at the bottom of this 100-foot sinkhole. Now, they gathered some people. This is the people that went out to help rescue Jack, but Ted Richmond was the key player in the rescue party because he was small enough and light enough for them to lower him down on a rope in this sinkhole. So that's what he did. He went down in the sinkhole, rescued Jack, and here is Jack. This is the hound right here named Jack that was rescued by Ted Richmond. And there's Ted. This is just, I relate this story just because it just shows you that Ted was an accepted and loved member of the community. Here, I bet he loved that attention with two young women probably hugging his neck for saving their dog, their family's hunting dog. Well, in 1951, a freelance author, writer by the name of Hartzell Spence decided to somehow got a wind of Ted Richmond, and in 1951 came to Newton County to do a story that he eventually sold to the Saturday Evening Post. Now, Hartzell Spence was a legitimate journalist. He was the founding editor of Yank magazine, which was the military newspaper published for soldiers during World War II. He also is credited with coining the word pinup for pinup girls. So Hartzell Spence was a legitimate author. He published Saturday Evening Post published the story in 1952, and it was entitled Modern Shepherd of the Hills. So there we harken back to that book, Shepherd of the Hills, that may have brought the Richmond family to the Ozarks in the first place. These are some pictures from that Saturday Evening Post article. And you can, of course, as is so typical of so many stories about the Ozarks, it's carefully scripted and carefully photographed to kind of perpetuate the Ozark stereotype in many ways. The caption for this photo is Richmond at his old home and original library. 4 years ago, his accumulated books, about 25,000, forced him to move into another cabin nearby. Oh, wrong way. That's not a great photo, but I wanted to blow it up enough to where you kind of get the idea of what his cabin looked like inside. Just crammed full of books everywhere, books, magazines. This photo from the Saturday Evening Post has a very interesting story behind it. Of course, you see the stereotypical, here, you got to have a shotgun. Hey, look, there's a Bowie knife. Look at this shirtless man holding a gun while Ted Richmond is sharing books with this sweet family. I mean, can you get any more hokey than that? Well, here's the story. I had the real privilege of interviewing this little girl who is now in her 80s, I'm guessing. And I should have, I didn't have any sense when I was talking to her, but I said to her, were you excited when you saw your picture in the Saturday Evening Post? And she looked at me like I had thrown cold water on her. She said, no, I was not. And the thing is, this is her family. This is her mom and dad, her brother. That's a neighbor who was not even from the Ozarks. He retired from Wisconsin. But people were ridiculed. This article in the Saturday Evening Post, people in Newton County took serious offense. A lot of people took serious offense at the slant that they felt that they were portrayed in this hillbilly stereotype. So she did not have a fond memory. And she said, that's not our house. They came and hung that knife on the wall. My dad would never have had a gun hanging like that. So it was humbling and fascinating for me to talk to her and realize that this was a hurtful thing. This was a hurtful thing for her family. And it ended up being a pretty hurtful thing for Ted Richmond. Here's another photo from the article. Now, I just want to know who's going to sit on an old rock. Really, he's going to deliver to their houses. They just picked as rough a place as they could find to talk about how remote this area was and how the absence of books, it's just perpetuating that stereotype. And here is that same shirtless man from Wisconsin that's not even a native Ozarker, out with Ted and his goats. But there he is with the pack. Now that's real. That's real enough. And then I love this photograph, that was in the Saturday Evening Post article. It's a meeting of the Ozark Artists and Writers Guild, which was that group that they founded, that he and Otto Rayburn founded in Kingston in the 1920s. This is an impressive showing of artists and writers that were in the Ozarks and interested enough in their craft to form an organization in the 1950s. And there's Ted right there. I believe this is the Jeff Rainey branch of the Wilderness Library. So this article comes out in the Saturday Evening Post, and many people, especially the townspeople in Jasper, were furious about it. A public meeting was called. Folklorist Vance Randolph and Otto Ernest Rayburn, who were both well-known folklorists by then, were terrified that Ted Richmond was going to get strung up, because the townspeople, the community, the people that didn't know Ted were blaming Ted for skewing this article, for portraying them as ignorant hillbillies. And they were afraid Ted was going to get lynched, truly. And not only Newton County residents were up in arms, but people all over the state, librarians across the state, newspaper editors rose up to decry this portrayal of the Ozarks, ergo Arkansas, as being bereft of public libraries. And in fact, the North Arkansas Regional Library System had been in place since 1944 and served residents of Newton County. So I see that they had a right to be upset, because Hartzell Spence never mentioned the existence of a library system in his article. He never mentioned that. Well, Ted said, I never said anything. I never said anything negative about my beloved people, friends and people here. He said that Hartzell Spence had promised to show Ted a draft of the article and allow him to review it. And in Hartzell Spence's papers at the University of Iowa, Spence says to the editor of the Saturday Evening Post, I never said that. I never made that agreement. And it caused a huge uproar. It surely devastated Ted Richmond, because while his closest friends stuck by him, many of his friends became wary of him. he lost friendships over this Saturday Evening Post article, which he only did because he wanted to continue advancing the cause of the Wilderness Library. But still, and this article may have signaled the beginning of the end for the Wilderness Library, but it did not stop Ted at that point. In May of 1953, so the article comes out in the fall of 1952. In May of 1953, Ted was the subject of a short film. There he is with his pack, produced by the U.S. Information Agency. That's the governmental arm that makes educational movies and often sends them overseas to, it's kind of a publicity arm of the government to show inspiring stories of American life. Now, when the producers of this film tried to track down Ted in Newton County, they discovered he was not in Newton County. He was in Texarkana, Texas. Now, what on earth was he doing in Texarkana, Texas, far away from home and the Wilderness Library in Newton County? Well, he was there with his bride of just a few months, this woman, Edna Garner. Edna was a member of that Ozark Writers and Artists Collective. She was an amateur poet, and pretty good, a very good writer from the letters I've read, very good writer. But she and Ted met through their mutual participation in the Ozark Artists and Writers Collective. She was a court clerk in Texarkana. She had been a widow for many years, and they married very quietly in 1953 without any fanfare, without any wedding. She announced the marriage to close friends in a typewritten note where she said, "We plan to spend a few weeks in the Ozarks for the present. I shall continue with my work as usual, and Ted will divide time between his house and mine while working on his book and other writing." You see, that the fact of it is she couldn't quit her job because she knew that Ted did not have enough income to sustain the both of them. And she also knew realistically that he had lived in these very modest conditions for many years, and it just, he himself told her this place is not fit for a woman to live in. So they split their time between Texarkana. She mostly stayed there, and occasionally she would come up to Mount Sherman, to the Wilderness Library. Many of her friends were aghast at this wedding. What have you done? What does that man do for a living? Are you working because you have to? She wrote in a letter to her friend, Isabel France, who was a journalist, and her papers are at the University Special Collections Division or Department. She wrote to Isabel France many times about just how cruel people were in these insinuations. And she said in one letter, Edna said, "If there were a place to live, halfway tenable, and an income of some kind or from some source sufficient to whack the wolf off the porch now and then, you may be sure I'd leave this job and take off for Arkansas." But 21 years of pouring out himself, 21 years of Ted pouring himself out for others, appreciative or not, has not provided any of the things, the barest necessities for a wife. Have you got any miracles you could turn on? We could use one right handily. After all, we do happen to love the other, and that right well. So I have no doubt that they were deeply in love and just were making the best of the situation as they could. They maintained their two households, one in the Newton County backwoods, one in the city of Texarkana. But the confrontations due to that Saturday Evening Post article had really, really begun to take a toll on Ted. Over time, his mental and emotional stability weakened until finally one of his neighbors called Ted's wife, Edna, down in Texarkana and said, you need to come and get him because he is not well. And she did. She came and took Ted back to Texarkana, where she cared for him until her death in 1960. They were only married 7 years. In April of 1963, the renowned journalist, Arkansas journalist Ernie Dean, who wrote a very popular column in the Arkansas Gazette on Arkansas people and places. It was a column entitled The Arkansas Traveler. And Ernie Dean often received many, many letters from people around the state and all over outside the state asking him, what about this little piece of Arkansas history? Or have you ever heard of this story? And someone in Malvern, Arkansas wrote to Ernie Dean and said, whatever happened to that person, that man that founded the Wilderness Library up there in Newton County? I can't remember his name. Well, Ernie Dean could not remember his name either. This is stunning to me that Ernie Dean, who knew everything about Arkansas, by the time of 1963, when Ernie Dean is asked about Ted Richmond, Ted's off the radar. Ernie Dean, of all people, doesn't know who Ted Richmond is. And Ernie went to the staff of the Arkansas Library Commission, who was able to track down Ted's name and a few tidbits about his story. And in a column that Ernie wrote entitled "Walking Librarian of the Ozarks Identified Maybe," Dean wrote, "I'm making some inquiries about Ted Richmond. If he's still around and willing to talk, I'll go up there into the hills and see him." And I'm so sad that Ted wasn't in those hills anymore, because a meeting between Ted Richmond and Ernie Dean would have been a meeting for Ozark history for the ages. Ted was in Texarkana. After Edna's death in 1960, he eventually moved to Tanglewood Nursing Home there in Texarkana, and he died there on December 3rd, 1975, and is buried at Rose Hill Cemetery with a World War I veterans marker in Texarkana. So it's sad when I stop and think about, oh my, Ted's earthly remains are down there in Texarkana, where he had no one but Edna and his beloved Ozarks. He's so far away from his beloved Ozarks. So I choose to think of him like this. I think this is where Ted is, walking along the twilight trail and ever reminding us still today to fight for things eternal. So that's the story of Ted Richmond, an amazing piece of Ozark history with connections to Eleanor Roosevelt, J. William Fulbright. Really great story. So
Yeah.
kudos to librarians. This is Corey. This is something for you to aspire to.
I know, that's very admirable too. Does anyone have any questions for Susan? You can unmute yourself if you want, or you can type in the chat box. I have a question.
Sure.
Do you know where the Twilight Trail is?
I have not been there myself. I'm told that the remnants of one of his cabins can still be seen, but it's fallen down and it's just a rubble of logs. I know sort of where there's a turnoff. You can get there, but I don't know how to get there. I have it on my agenda for one of the local folks one of the local folks has promised to take me there once this pandemic is past us. But it's on the road to Kyle's Landing, and I'm told you make a right turn.
Hmm.
So that's as much as I can tell you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering, because there's a lot of trails over there, and I wondered if you could still get to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I talked to a member of the Rainey family who were very close to Ted, and he was a young fella. He was young. He never knew Ted. He's not so young anymore, but he was able to get in the cabin that was on his family, the Rainey branch of the Wilderness Library, and was able to rescue some books and a few paper things. But it's just tragic that, so knowing the correspondence that he wrote and that he kept everything Ted did, it's really sad that all that ephemera, that paper history is just gone.
Yeah.
It wasn't preserved.
No, it's
What
kind of
else?
a tragic story. Yeah.
Well, it is kind of tragic. Yeah. And he was that PTSD. He was not,
Yeah.
he marched to his own drum even before World War I think, but certainly that he was driven as a result of PTSD, but he did some wonderful things out of his drive he was a compassionate person that really saw his calling in bringing books to the people of the mountains in Newton County. So go to Jasper when the pandemic's over and we can get out again. Go to Jasper, make a day trip, go to the Newton County Library, ask to see Ted Richmond's backpack, and then go eat at the Ozark Cafe. It'll be a great day for you.
Yeah, there's a big movement right now to talk about there's quite a few books that have been published in the last few years about the book women of Kentucky that were
Yes.
going on horseback. And it's kind of our own version of that in a way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, yeah, I've not tracked it would be interesting to see what was Ted reading about did the book women get notoriety in their day? Were newspaper articles being written in their day about, was he influenced by them at all, by that project?
Yeah. Did they talk about it much, or was it just a thing the locals knew about? And yeah, and I think a lot of those were funded by the government in some sort of fashion, because those women did make money. And so I don't know, I'm a little surprised there wasn't some sort of thing like that in Arkansas,
and I don't know if it's because Arkansas had a library system of sorts, if they were beyond that, if they were already to a point where there were library, there were bookmobiles that went around in Boone and Carroll and in Newton County too, at the same time Ted was doing his library, or later, in the later years of when Ted was doing his library. And Ted received many books as donations, but I don't know that he ever received much financial assistance. So he would say to Mrs. Roosevelt, my money is going for the library. I don't have, he wasn't begging, but he was wanting her to know that every dime he's raising is for that library. He's making enough to get by, just barely, with his goats. And he did have a small pension that he collected, but he wanted her to know that he was strictly, sincerely asking for financial donations to support the library.
Yeah, because that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I'm impressed by that many books too. That's a lot of books. That's more.
Yeah, but I say, he didn't have a card catalog, so he didn't have to worry about, and no due dates, no overdue fines.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you probably didn't know what the names of all of them either.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I thank you all for coming tonight, for letting me share Ted Richmond with you for a little bit this evening. Yeah, hope everybody stays safe and warm.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And if did you see what Fran said?
Was that the Fran? No, I can't. Where do I get to the chat? Oh, Kathleen. Thank you, Kathleen. Oh, Fran. So that is the Fran. So Fran in the audience, I'm just going to brag on you, Fran. I was so hoping that was you. Fran is the daughter of Ernie Dean, and Ernie Dean is just my hero in the world of historic preservation. He led the charge to save Old Main. He has written, he wrote in his Arkansas Traveler column so many wonderful articles. He would just go out and find everyday people to talk about. He wasn't talking about the big politicians who made it on the front page. He was writing about us every folks that were in Arkansas, and just a consummate journalist. So Fran, I'm glad you came, and you're right. Ted and Ernie, maybe they're talking right now, Fran. Ted and Ernie are up in heaven talking. They're not having a drink together though, because Ted was a teetotaler. All right. Anything else? Seeing none?
I guess not. Well, thank you so much, Susan. That was really
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Thank you for coming.
good.
Good to hope to see you all again soon.
Yeah,
Maybe in person sometime.
hope so.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.